Hi, I'm Maria, this is my cat Ted, and welcome back to our SEL video series. In this video, we'll talk about why SEL is so important right now. So, there is a pretty obvious reason. COVID. Since March 2020, people across the world have been experiencing a collective trauma. The way we work has changed, the way we do school has changed, the way we interact with other people in public places has changed. It's something that we're all experiencing at the same time. Supporting students now, when we've been through a trauma and we are continuing to go through a trauma, is really, really hard. In the last video, linked down below, I talked about how all of our interactions as adults and as teachers influence students' social emotional learning. So, understanding some of the impacts of trauma on the brain and on students' development is super important. As educators, we can help students learn to regulate their emotions and cope with trauma so that they can learn. We'll do this in two parts. In part one, we'll talk a little bit about trauma and the effects of trauma on the brain. In part two, we'll talk about some concrete strategies that you can do in whatever your school environment looks like to support your students with regulation. Trauma may show as grief, it might show as anxiety, it might show as acting out or even acting in. When kids experience trauma, it can have a long-term effect on their brain and their brain development. I'm not an expert in neuroscience, I have an education background, but I'm just going to share a high-level overview in this video today. There are some organizations like the Momentous Institute that do a lot of work around this, around the brain's development. So I'm going to link to them down below. If you think that the content is interesting and you want to learn more, you can check them out. Okay, so the brain. The front part of the brain, called the prefrontal cortex, is where our brain does a lot of its higher order thinking, like processing language and complex reasoning. So, understandably, in a classroom setting, the prefrontal cortex is super important. Think about how much of our learning is tied to language, either processing language that's being spoken or reading directions or reading from a textbook or reading literature. So much of our academic learning is tied to language. When a trauma occurs or is occurring, or when our brains sense something and think that we're unsafe, we go into what's called fight, flight, or freeze mode, which basically shuts down the prefrontal cortex. So, when our brains are in a state of fear or they're in a state of alarm or agitated, we're actually not using that prefrontal cortex, front part of our brain that processes language, that processes higher order thinking and reasoning to think. Then what happens is the part of our brain that controls emotions, the amygdala, and our lizard brain, or the brainstem, which controls like our basic bodily functions like breathing, kick in and take over from that prefrontal cortex. Traumatic events, when they happen, they process in the brain often as emotions. This means that students are not using their prefrontal cortex, the language and reasoning part of their brain, to process what's happening around them. If a student is in a state of alarm or fear, they're processing things like nonverbal cues, like body language, or like the tone that you're saying things. So when we help students to regulate their emotions, either by helping them to co-regulate, giving them skills that can help them to regulate their emotion, we're helping them shift their brain from a state of fear or alarm to a state of alertness or terror, which means that they can use that prefrontal cortex and they can learn. Regulating emotions is not the same as controlling emotions or bottling your emotions up inside. Regulating emotions just means that you can recognize and cope with emotions as they happen, and that your emotions are appropriate to the level of the situation. When a student is unable to regulate their emotions by themselves, they might have an outsized response to something that you perceive as being small, or they might have a response to something that you haven't even perceived, like another student looking at them. And that's because their brain is processing information with the amygdala and with the brainstem. So with that emotional part of their brain, they're not paying attention to language, they're paying attention to nonverbal cues. An important thing to remember is that regulating emotions is not a character trait. It's not something that you're born being able to do. It's not something that some people can just do and some people can't do. It's something that is learned and practiced and applied, just like anything else in the school setting. So not only do we need to teach students these skills to support regulation, but we also have to give them opportunities to practice and apply them. Because emotional situations don't happen in a vacuum, it's not the same every time. Students need chances to practice and to help regulate and to get feedback and to try over and over again, because it's a skill that is learned and that they can develop. So, how can we support students with SEL right now? Let's look at the CASEL framework again. We're focusing on self-awareness, so identifying emotions, affirming identity and feelings, and self-management. The first and probably most important way that you can support students with SEL right now, whether you're in a virtual setting, a hybrid setting, or you're in person, is to build strong relationships with students. If you're in a virtual or if you're in a hybrid classroom, you're probably going to have to be more intentional about this than you would be if you were in person, because you don't get those little informal opportunities like greeting students in the hallway or seeing them at lunch to connect and build relationships with students. By building strong relationships with students, you become a trusted adult in their life. By building that safe relationship and the safe classroom environment, you can affirm students' identities and help them learn to regulate and identify their own emotions. These are both things that will have a long-lasting impact on their life, whether right now they're in virtual school, they're in a hybrid setting, or they're in the classroom. Building strong relationships doesn't just mean connecting, but it means being consistent with your behavior and with your responses to students. By doing so, you're modeling regulation and you're helping students to co-regulate. Because you're consistent, their brains know that they can count on you. The second piece is supporting students with skills that they can use to cope and regulate their emotions. Then, giving them opportunities to practice and apply those skills that they're learning in real-world contexts. So, using breathing strategies like the box breathing strategy, or pancake breaths, which is where we breathe in, we flip the pancakes, and we breathe out. Remember that when students are feeling stressed or their brains are in a state of fear, they're not processing with their prefrontal cortex, they're processing with the amygdala and with their brainstem. So brainstem is super closely tied to your body, to your breathing. So by slowing down your breath, by modeling that, by teaching that to students, you're actually helping them to shift their brain from a state of fear or alarm into a state of calmness. Remember, if you're using these breathing strategies, sometimes calm and quiet can actually be a reminder of a past trauma for a kid. So if there was a time that they were traumatized when they were being calm and quiet, that calm and quiet time might actually be really hard for them. So if you're using any of these strategies, just make sure that you're checking in with your class, you're watching to see how students respond, and you try things until you find some that work for your specific students. You can also use strategies like a mood meter or emoji check-ins to help students learn to identify and name the emotions that they're feeling. People who have trauma in their past or who are going through a trauma or a period of instability like right now, they might have an outsized reaction to unpredictability. So by providing a schedule, by providing structure, you're actually supporting their brain. Building that safety and predictability signals to the brain, I am safe. Even in a virtual classroom environment, sharing the agenda, sharing the daily or weekly schedule can help students feel safe in a virtual classroom environment. If you have to make a change to your schedule that wasn't anticipated, telling students in advance so that they have some time to process and anticipate that change can also help the transition to be easier than just an abrupt transition. So whenever possible, let students know ahead of time of any changes that are coming to their schedule. Not knowing what's coming next can be a huge source of anxiety for people if they're already in a state of fear or in a state of alarm. So providing structure and consistency through scheduling can help to ease that anxiety. So now you've learned a little bit about the brain and some strategies that you can use to support students in any classroom environment. If you like this video and you like this content, give us a like and subscribe so you can catch all of our SEL series as it comes out. See you next time.